long and often unpredictable chronicle of human conflict. Wars have been declared over land, gold, religion, pride, and politics. Yet among all these reasons, there is one conflict so peculiar that it borders on the absurd, a war that began not with the clash of armies or the ambition of kings but with a pastry. In the year 1838, the young and struggling nation of Mexico found itself under siege by France. One of Europe's most powerful empires, the cannons roared, cities trembled, and the port of Veracruz was reduced to rubble, and the official pretext behind all this destruction was a complaint made by a French pastry chef whose shop had been looted by Mexican soldiers. It sounds like the plot of a dark comedy. Yet behind the absurd name, the Pastry War hides a complex story of pride, humiliation, and political maneuvering. Beneath the surface of this anecdote lies the tragic reality of a nation still bleeding from its struggle for independence and a European power eager to prove its strength on foreign soil. To understand how a pastry could become the spark for international conflict, one must first understand the fragile world of Mexico in the 1830s, a country in constant turmoil, exhausted by revolution, and uncertain of its own identity. The Pastry War was not simply about one man's destroyed bakery, nor about compensation for damaged goods. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and the painful adolescence of a new nation. This is the story of how absurdity became a pretext for invasion, and how Mexico, barely 2 decades free from Spain, would once again face the guns of a European empire. Mexico in the 1830s was a nation still learning to breathe. It had won its independence from Spain only 17 years earlier. After a brutal war that left the land devastated and its people divided, the promise of freedom, that glowing ideal which had inspired the revolution, was quickly replaced by chaos, infighting, and betrayal. The first decades of independence were a carousel of presidents, coups, and constitutions. Every faction claimed to hold the truth, every general proclaimed himself a savior, and the people watched as their dreams of stability dissolved into dust. The economy was in ruins, roads and ports were neglected, crops failed, and the government's coffers were empty. Soldiers went unpaid for months, sometimes years. It was a time when revolutions were not events but seasons, when the cry of rebellion echoed as predictably as the monsoon rains. In such a fragile environment, corruption flourished, every official looked after his own pocket, and justice was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. In this chaos lived hundreds of foreigners, English traders, Spanish priests, American adventurers, and French artisans who had come to Mexico seeking fortune. Among them were many French citizens who established cafes, small factories, and shops, bringing with them their refined manners and their sense of European superiority. To them, Mexico was a land of opportunity but also of frustration. A place where the law seemed to change with every sunrise. One of these men was Monsieur Remontal, a French pastry chef who owned a small shop in the suburb of Tacubaya, just outside Mexico City. His business was modest, a place where the wealthy and the nostalgic could find sweet echoes of Paris, éclairs, tarts, and delicate pastries that reminded them of home. For years, Remontal served diplomats, officers, and members of the Mexican elite who enjoyed his desserts with tea and gossip. Yet, in 1832, during one of the countless uprisings that shook the capital, his peaceful shop became a victim of the times. A group of Mexican soldiers, hungry, unpaid, and desperate, entered his establishment. They looted the shelves, smashed the counters, and devoured the pastries without paying a single coin. The event was small, almost banal in a country where chaos was daily life, but for Remontal, it was an outrage. He demanded justice and compensation. He took his grievance to the Mexican authorities, claiming that he had suffered enormous losses. His demand amounted to 60,000 pesos. An absurd fortune, far beyond the true value of his little shop. The authorities, overwhelmed by thousands of similar complaints, ignored him. To them, his claim was just one more in a long list of foreign merchants lamenting their misfortunes. Years passed, but Remontal's anger did not fade. He continued to press his case, writing letters and petitions that eventually reached the French embassy. The story caught the attention of French officials who saw in it not a trivial complaint but an opportunity. France, under the rule of King Louis-Philippe, was eager to reaffirm its prestige on the world stage. The July monarchy had been born out of revolution, and Louis-Philippe called himself the citizen king. A man of moderation, a monarch who sought legitimacy through order and industry rather than conquest. Yet, beneath his cautious exterior, he knew that his government needed victories, symbols of power that could remind France and the world that it still commanded respect. Mexico, unstable, poor, and isolated, seemed an easy target. French merchants living there had long complained about lost investments, confiscated goods, and the general lawlessness that plagued their businesses. Diplomats in Paris compiled these grievances into a formal list of claims, and among them, almost mockingly, was Remontal's demand for 60,000 pesos. It was the perfect story to capture public sympathy. A humble baker wronged by a chaotic republic, a simple citizen seeking justice abroad. By the late 1830s, France's patience had run out. The government demanded that Mexico pay a total indemnity of 600,000 pesos to compensate all French citizens for their alleged losses. For Mexico, this was an impossible sum. The treasury was nearly empty, the country still recovering from internal wars and foreign debts. President Anastasio Bustamante refused to comply, viewing the demand as both unjust and humiliating. France responded with force. In 1838, a fleet of French warships crossed the Atlantic and anchored off the coast of Veracruz. The message was clear: pay the indemnity, or face the consequences. The absurd complaint of a pastry chef had transformed into a diplomatic ultimatum backed by cannons. As news spread across Mexico, disbelief turned to outrage. How could a nation that had fought for its freedom from Spain now be threatened by France over a pastry? But outrage alone could not repel warships. The French blockade began, cutting off Mexico's most important port, strangling its trade, and deepening its economic misery. Behind this absurdity lay something deeper, the shadow of colonial arrogance. For France, this was not truly about Remontal's cakes or damaged property. It was a demonstration, a lesson meant to remind the world that European powers could still discipline young nations that dared to ignore them. For Mexico, it was a painful reminder of its fragility, a test of whether its independence meant anything beyond words. As the French ships loomed off the coast, and as the demands for payment grew louder, Mexico prepared for a confrontation it could neither afford nor avoid. Among those who answered the call to defend the nation was a man whose name would soon return to legend: Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the same general who had lost Texas only 2 years earlier. His fate, like that of Mexico itself, would once again be bound to the strange war that began with a pastry. When the French fleet appeared on the horizon of the Gulf of Mexico in late 1838, the people of Veracruz watched with uneasy silence. The ships carried not only cannons and soldiers but a message from Europe to the young American republics: your independence does not yet make you equals. The blockade was swift and decisive. France's naval power, polished by centuries of empire, closed around the Mexican coast like an iron fist. Veracruz, Mexico's most vital port and lifeline to the Atlantic, was now trapped under foreign control. At first, many Mexicans believed it to be a bluff, an intimidation tactic to force payment, yet the French commander, Admiral Charles Baudin, was not a man of idle threats. He demanded that Mexico pay the 600,000 pesos or face bombardment. The Mexican government refused once more, hoping Britain might intervene diplomatically or that France would lose patience and withdraw. But diplomacy failed, and the cannon spoke. In November 1838, Baudin ordered his fleet to open fire. The fortress of San Juan de Ulua, built during the colonial era to guard the entrance to Veracruz, stood as the city's last bastion. Its walls, weathered by salt and sun, had once defied pirates and invaders. Now, they faced the full might of the French navy. The bombardment began at dawn. The sea thundered with explosions as French shells struck the ancient stone ramparts. Smoke rose in thick clouds that blurred the horizon. Inside the fortress, Mexican soldiers returned fire with outdated artillery, their powder damp from the sea air, their morale shaken. The defenders fought bravely, but the disparity in power was undeniable. France's modern cannons could strike with precision and range that Mexico's guns could not match. Within hours, the city trembled, buildings crumbled, and fires spread through the streets of Veracruz. Civilians fled inland, carrying what little they could. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the cries of the wounded and the sound of church bells tolling in alarm. The war that had begun as a farcical diplomatic dispute had now become brutally real. Among the chaos stood one figure who refused to retreat: General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Only 2 years earlier, he had been disgraced by the loss of Texas, his name a symbol of defeat. Yet Santa Anna was not a man to fade quietly into obscurity. Ambitious, cunning, and theatrical, he saw in this crisis an opportunity to restore his reputation and his influence. He rushed to Veracruz, declaring that he would lead the defense of the nation against foreign aggression. For the people, Santa Anna's arrival was both a relief and a spectacle. Dressed in full uniform, He rode through the streets with calculated heroism, his voice booming with patriotic fervor. He promised to defend the soil of Mexico or die trying. To his critics, it was vanity disguised as courage. To his supporters, it was redemption. As the French continued their bombardment, Santa Anna gathered what forces he could, a mix of soldiers, volunteers, and local militia. Their weapons were old, their training inconsistent, but they shared a common purpose: to resist humiliation. For Santa Anna, the task was not merely military but symbolic. Mexico had been mocked as weak and divided. Now, he would prove that the nation still had pride. On the morning of December 5, Santa Anna launched a bold counterattack. His men moved under cover of smoke, attempting to cut off French troops who had landed near the port. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Bullets tore through the humid air as Mexican and French soldiers clashed in the narrow streets and along the shore. Amid the confusion, Santa Anna himself was struck by enemy fire. A cannonball shattered his left leg, throwing him violently from his horse. He was carried away bleeding but conscious, shouting orders even as his men dragged him to safety. The attack failed. Veracruz remained under French control, and the fortress of San Juan de Ulua fell soon after. Yet Santa Anna's wound transformed him from a disgraced general into a national hero once more. The newspapers in Mexico City hailed his bravery, describing him as the man who had sacrificed a limb for the honor of his country. In the months that followed, his amputated leg would become a symbol, paraded, buried, and even later exhumed as a relic of patriotism. Meanwhile, France tightened its grip. The blockade devastated Mexico's economy, halting all maritime trade. The price of food soared, and goods became scarce. Merchants cursed both governments, France for its arrogance, and Mexico for its stubborn pride. In Europe, newspapers mocked the entire affair, calling it the war for a pastry, a joke that delighted Parisian salons and London drawing rooms alike. Yet for the people of Veracruz, there was nothing humorous about starvation and ruin. King Louis-Philippe's government, however, was pleased. The demonstration of power had succeeded in proving that France could still project its will across the world. Admiral Baudin became a celebrated figure. Praised for defending French honor against a lawless republic, the Mexican government, humiliated and desperate, sought mediation. Britain, maintaining its usual balance between self-interest and diplomacy, offered to broker peace. By early 1839, negotiations began. Mexico agreed to pay the demanded indemnity, though it lacked the funds to do so immediately. France, satisfied with its show of strength, withdrew its fleet after several months of occupation. The war had lasted barely a year but left a deep scar on Mexico's pride and economy. Yet what lingered most was the absurdity of it all. A great European empire had sent ships across the ocean, shelled a city, and maimed a general, all for a baker's complaint. To some, it was a farce; to others, a lesson in power. The Pastry War exposed the fragile balance between justice and domination, between dignity and survival. For Santa Anna, the war had been a personal resurrection. From the ruins of Veracruz, he rose again as a national figure, soon to reclaim the presidency and once more shape the destiny of Mexico. For better or worse, for France, it was a minor triumph that would soon be forgotten, overshadowed by larger ambitions in Africa and Asia. But for Mexico, it was a bitter reminder that independence was not a guarantee of respect. In the quiet that followed, Veracruz rebuilt itself. The walls of San Juan de Ulua were patched, the markets reopened, and life resumed its slow rhythm. Yet beneath the calm, resentment simmered. The people had learned that foreign powers still viewed Mexico not as an equal nation but as a territory to be disciplined. The laughter in Parisian cafes over the so-called Pastry War was heard like an echo of mockery across the ocean, and so, history recorded it as a curiosity, a war for a cake, a minor episode in the annals of empire. But behind the irony lay tragedy, pride, and the eternal struggle of a young country to command respect in a world still ruled by imperial arrogance. The war had ended, but its moral, that the powerful could disguise greed beneath the mask of justice, would echo in Mexico's history for decades to come. The cannon fire at Veracruz had barely faded when the legend of Antonio López de Santa Anna began to rise again from the smoke. His leg, lost in the defense of the port, became not merely a wound but a symbol. In a country hungry for heroes, where victory had been scarce and humiliation frequent, Santa Anna's sacrifice offered something tangible, proof that someone had bled for the honor of the nation. Newspapers, clergy, and politicians all turned his misfortune into a story of redemption. The man who had been blamed for the loss of Texas was suddenly reborn as the savior of Mexico. In the aftermath of the Pastry War, Mexico was left in financial ruin and political confusion. The indemnity owed to France loomed over the treasury. Foreign debts multiplied, and the people were weary of the endless cycle of revolts and coups. Amid this exhaustion, Santa Anna's name became a beacon, a convenient myth. His mutilation was transformed into a metaphor for Mexico itself. Wounded, humiliated, yet still alive and defiant, as his health recovered, Santa Anna began to understand the power of this myth. He was not only a general anymore. He was a living emblem of patriotism. Visitors came to see him in his hacienda at Manga de Clavo, where he received them like a monarch. Diplomats, officers, and journalists were greeted by a man wrapped in elegance and calculation, reclining in his chair while his missing limb rested in a glass case. Carefully preserved for public viewing, he would speak with theatrical gravity, describing how the cannonball had struck him, how he had refused to cry out, and how his only concern had been the safety of Mexico. This spectacle was not merely vanity, it was strategy. Santa Anna knew that in a nation tired of chaos, image was as powerful as leadership. The people did not want a perfect man, they wanted a story, a figure larger than life who could embody both suffering and pride. He gave them exactly that. The general with one leg became the man who had given part of his body to defend the fatherland. By 1841, the government was once again on the brink of collapse. President Anastasio Bustamante had lost the confidence of both liberals and conservatives. Revolts erupted across the country, and order seemed impossible. In the midst of this turmoil, Santa Anna declared that the time had come to save the nation once more. He gathered troops, marched on the capital, and seized power almost effortlessly. The same people who had cursed his name after Texas now cheered his return. His new rule began with grand promises of unity and progress. He spoke of national regeneration, of restoring Mexico's dignity in the eyes of the world. He ordered parades, commissioned portraits, and built monuments to honor those who had died in defense of the homeland. At the center of these ceremonies was always his missing leg, now buried with full military honors in Mexico City. The funeral of a limb was an event so strange that even foreign observers were astonished. Soldiers marched solemnly, bands played patriotic hymns, and politicians delivered speeches of mourning and pride. The people threw flowers over the coffin, weeping as if a national hero himself had died. Yet beneath the pageantry, the same flaws that had haunted Mexico since independence returned. Santa Anna's leadership was theatrical but shallow. He loved ceremony more than governance, loyalty more than efficiency. His ministers changed constantly, and his policies swung between liberal reform and conservative repression depending on what benefited his grip on power. The treasury remained empty, the army disorganized, and the provinces restless. Still, for a time, his charisma held the country together. Foreign observers noted that while Mexico was poor, its leader carried himself with the arrogance of an emperor. He lived in splendor, surrounding himself with musicians, servants, and soldiers who adored him. His estate at Manga de Clavo became a court in miniature, filled with banquets, processions, and ostentatious generosity. He distributed favors and punishments with the same dramatic flair, ensuring that his legend, rather than his policies, remained at the center of attention. The memory of the Pastry War lingered in all of this. It had taught Santa Anna two crucial lessons: that foreign humiliation could be turned into national glory, and that in a country desperate for pride, even a defeat could be repainted as heroism. He understood that symbols could be stronger than truth, and he used that understanding with masterful cynicism. But the same arrogance that had fueled his rise would soon lead to his downfall once more. His rule became increasingly despotic, his decisions impulsive and self-serving. He imposed new taxes, silenced critics, and surrounded himself with flatterers who fed his vanity. The people who had once adored him began to murmur against him. Yet Santa Anna, convinced of his destiny, ignored all warning signs. In 1842, he ordered his leg, the one buried in Mexico City with pomp and glory, to be exhumed and reburied with even greater ceremony. This time, the event turned into a grotesque parody. Crowds gathered, some mocking, others indifferent. What had once inspired reverence now provoked laughter. The myth was cracking. The same people who had raised him as a hero began to see him as a man intoxicated by his own legend. Still, fate was not done with Santa Anna. In the coming years, new storms would rise: foreign invasions, internal rebellions, and the loss of vast territories that would forever alter the map of Mexico. The Pastry War, though small in comparison to what was to come, had set the stage for everything. It had resurrected Santa Anna's career and created the pattern he would repeat again and again. Disaster followed by redemption. Defeat turned into spectacle, and politics transformed into theater. For now, however, he stood triumphant, his name restored, his enemies silenced. The French had come and gone, and he had turned their victory into his own. He believed himself untouchable, chosen by fate to guide Mexico through chaos. But history, as it often does, had other plans. The echoes of the cannons at Veracruz were not yet silent. They would soon return, louder and more devastating than before, as the ambitions of one man collided with the fate of a nation still struggling to define itself. The smoke had cleared from Veracruz, but the echoes of the cannons traveled far beyond the shores of the Gulf. What had begun as a limited act of retaliation had now become something far more profound. The Pastry War, brief as it was, sent tremors through the fragile Mexican Republic and resonated deeply within the European imagination. It was not only a lesson in power but a reflection of how the old empires viewed the new world. A theater in which prestige mattered more than justice, and strength mattered more than reason. In the corridors of Paris, the news of victory was met with satisfaction. The monarchy of Louis-Philippe needed triumphs, however small, to feed the illusion of France's renewed grandeur. In cafes and salons, people spoke of Mexico as a land of chaos, a place that had to be disciplined, tamed, civilized. The war, to them, was proof that France still held the torch of order against the darkness of republican disorder. Yet for Mexico, the consequences were far from symbolic. The war had laid bare its weaknesses, not just military, but political and moral. The republic was fractured, its government paralyzed by factionalism and corruption. The treasury was empty, the army disorganized, and the people weary of endless revolts that promised reform but delivered only new tyrannies. Veracruz had been bombarded, its trade strangled, its dignity wounded. The indemnity demanded by France was yet another debt in a nation drowning in debts. But the deeper injury was psychological. To many Mexicans, it felt as though independence had been stolen once more, not by Spain, but by the arrogance of Europe. In the aftermath, the figure of Santa Anna loomed larger than ever. His mutilation had transformed him into both martyr and myth. He walked with a limp, wrapped in self-fashioned glory, speaking of sacrifice and destiny. Crowds greeted him as the savior who had faced the French invaders and paid the price in flesh. It was a performance he knew how to perfect. He understood that in a country craving heroes, pain could be turned into power. The lost leg, buried with full military honors, became an object of national devotion. Newspapers printed poems about it, and public ceremonies were held in its memory. The irony was almost too great to bear. A nation that could not feed its poor found comfort in venerating a severed limb. But Santa Anna was not alone in shaping the narrative. Across Mexico, writers, priests, and politicians debated the meaning of the war. Some saw it as proof that the republic must become stronger, more centralized, capable of resisting foreign threats. Others argued that the real enemy was internal. That until corruption and ambition were purged, Mexico would always be vulnerable to outside manipulation. The newspapers of the time reflect a kind of collective soul-searching, a questioning of what the country had truly achieved since independence. Was it a nation, or merely a collection of provinces bound together by exhaustion and fear? France, for its part, did not linger on the war's moral questions. The Pastry War became a footnote in the annals of European diplomacy, a demonstration of naval efficiency, a polite warning to other nations not to trifle with French citizens abroad. In private, however, some within the French government knew the truth, that the victory was hollow. The cost of the expedition, the death of sailors, the criticism from Britain, all weighed against the prestige it had supposedly restored. Yet, like all empires, France preferred the illusion of triumph to the admission of futility. History would remember the shells that shattered Veracruz, not the moral emptiness behind them. Meanwhile, within Mexico, the scars of the conflict deepened existing divisions. The conservatives used the war as evidence that the republic was ungovernable, arguing that the country needed a strong, centralized authority, perhaps even a monarchy, to protect it from foreign aggression. The liberals countered that only through democracy and civic education could Mexico become truly independent. The debates grew heated, the factions more entrenched. Each side claimed to be the guardian of national dignity, yet both contributed to its erosion. The Pastry War had ended militarily, but politically, it had only just begun. By the early 1840s, the echoes of that brief war still haunted the Mexican psyche. The economy struggled to recover, the army remained divided, and the shadow of foreign intervention loomed ever larger. Indeed, the lessons unlearned from the Pastry War would return with terrible clarity in 1862, when France invaded again, this time not for pastries, but for empire. The ambitions of Napoleon III would turn Mexico into a battleground once more, and the ghosts of Veracruz would rise from their watery graves to witness an empire's second attempt at control. In that later war, the patterns were eerily familiar, European arrogance cloaked in civilizing rhetoric, Mexican bravery undermined by internal betrayal, and the eternal struggle between pride and pragmatism. But for now, in the aftermath of 1838, the guns were silent, the French fleet had departed, leaving behind the broken stones of the fortress of San Juan de Ulloa and the bitter taste of humiliation. In the cantinas and marketplaces, people spoke of the war half in anger, half in disbelief. How could such destruction have come from something as trivial as a pastry? Some laughed bitterly, others cursed the French, and a few whispered that perhaps it was divine punishment for the endless divisions that tore their country apart. The truth was simpler and sadder. It was a war born not of desert or debt, but of pride, human pride, national pride, imperial pride, and like all wars of pride, it left behind nothing but silence and smoke. Yet in that silence, something else began to stir, a question, faint but persistent: what did it truly mean to be independent? Was freedom merely the absence of colonial masters, or was it the ability to stand with dignity, to govern oneself, to be respected as an equal among nations? The Pastry War had provided no answers, but it had forced the question upon the Mexican people, and in the decades to come, as revolutions continued to shake the land, that question would haunt every constitution, every uprising, every fleeting victory. The echoes of empire did not vanish with the French ships, they lingered in the air, invisible but unrelenting, reminding Mexico that the shadow of Europe was not easily escaped. The years following the Pastry War were marked not by recovery, but by the slow, uneasy bleeding of a nation that could not find peace with itself. Though the cannons had long fallen silent, the wounds left behind were not of the kind that time could easily heal. They were wounds of humiliation, of distrust, and of memory. The war had ended in 1839, yet the echoes of that absurd conflict lived on in every political speech, every military uprising, and every promise of reform that ended in betrayal. Mexico, barely 2 decades old as an independent nation, seemed unable to escape the gravity of its own chaos. Its revolutions had become habits, its heroes temporary, its governments transient shadows that flickered and vanished before the ink on their proclamations had even dried. The Pastry War had shown the world that Mexico was vulnerable, and once a nation is marked as weak, the world rarely lets it forget. Diplomats, merchants, and foreign powers remembered Veracruz not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. In the years that followed, British, Spanish, and American interests deepened their reach into Mexican affairs. Loans were negotiated under unfair terms. Trade agreements favored outsiders more than citizens. The Mexican government, desperate for stability, sold promises it could not keep and concessions it would later regret. It was a new kind of conquest, waged not with bayonets but with contracts, not with armies but with banks. The empire had changed its uniform but not its appetite. Within Mexico itself, the Pastry War became a mirror for all that was broken. Politicians invoked it as a warning, each twisting its meaning to suit their own agenda. For conservatives, it was proof that only a strong, centralized authority could defend the nation, a return, perhaps, to the old order that Spain had once imposed. For liberals, it was evidence that tyranny, whether foreign or domestic, was the true enemy, and that liberty must be preserved even in chaos. Between these poles, the country tore itself apart. Coups erupted like storms, constitutions were written and burned, generals traded loyalty for power. The name of Santa Anna returned again and again like a ghost that refused to rest. His leg, long since buried with pomp and honor, became a symbol both of sacrifice and of the grotesque theater that politics had become. By the mid-1840s, the wounds of the Pastry War had become scars etched into Mexico's soul. The lessons it should have taught, unity, diplomacy, and restraint, were forgotten when the United States, driven by its dream of manifest destiny, turned its eyes southward. Mexico was once again unprepared. The invasion that began in 1846, leading to the loss of nearly half the country's territory, was, in many ways, the true consequence of the Pastry War. For while the two conflicts were separated by years and motives, the same disease lay beneath both, division within and exploitation from without. Veracruz had been the rehearsal. The Mexican-American War was the catastrophe. The empire that had once bombarded Mexico over a pastry had been replaced by a new empire, hungrier and closer to home. For the common people, these great movements of history meant only suffering. The farmers in the valleys, the traders in the markets, the soldiers who fought and died under flags that changed with the season, all felt the consequences of the nation's endless turmoil. To them, the Pastry War was not a diplomatic event but another episode in a story of broken promises. They had seen governments fall, taxes rise, and foreign troops march through their streets, all in the name of ideals that never seemed to reach them. The dreams of independence, once bright and noble, had faded into something brittle and tired. What had the revolutions achieved if foreign cannons could still dictate their fate? And yet, amidst the despair, there were voices that refused to be silenced. Writers, poets, and thinkers began to look at the Pastry War not just as a humiliation, but as a lesson, a symbol of the need for a true kind of independence. They asked what it meant to be a nation, to be free not only in name but in spirit. They saw in Veracruz ruins the price of disunity, and in Santa Anna's theatrics the emptiness of vanity. These were the intellectual seeds that would, much later, influence a new generation, one that sought reform not through war, but through law and education. The wounds, though unhealed, had begun to whisper new possibilities. Still, the deeper pain persisted. Every foreign intervention, every rebellion, seemed to reopen the old scars. When, in 1862, French troops once again landed on Mexican soil, claiming to bring order and civilization, many saw it not as a new invasion but as the return of an old ghost. The Pastry War had been a prologue, and now the second act was beginning. This time, it would lead to an emperor, Maximilian, and to another cycle of blood and betrayal. The empire's echoes had become footsteps once more upon Mexican ground. The same cannons that had once bombarded Veracruz now thundered again, not in vengeance, but in repetition. Looking back, historians often treat the Pastry War as a curiosity, an absurd anecdote in the long and tragic novel of the 19th century, but to reduce it to a joke is to miss its meaning. It was not about a pastry, nor even about money. It was about respect, the respect that nations crave and the pride they destroy themselves to preserve. It was about how the world measures power, and how those without it are forced to bow or bleed. It was about how easily one man's grievance can become a pretext for empire, and it was about how a young republic, desperate to prove itself, found that pride can be as dangerous as weakness. Even decades later, when new generations of Mexicans spoke of independence, the memory of the Pastry War lingered in the background like a bitter taste. It was a reminder that freedom, once won, must be defended not only with arms but with wisdom, and that dignity cannot be demanded from others until it is found within. The war's absurdity became its enduring power, a lesson dressed in ridicule. For behind the laughter at the idea of a war over a cake lies the tragedy of nations that have forgotten how fragile respect can be, and how costly it is to regain once lost. And so, the Pastry War did not truly end in 1839, it lived on in the treaties that followed, in the revolutions that shook the land, in the cynical smiles of diplomats who saw in Mexico a playground for their ambitions. Its wounds never healed because they were not just physical, they were wounds of pride, of fear, of longing, and perhaps, in some quiet way, they never will, for the ghosts of Veracruz still whisper when the wind blows from the Gulf, carrying the faint sound of cannons long silenced, reminding Mexico, and the world, that even the smallest insult can spark the greatest folly when honor becomes more sacred than reason. History often hides its deepest truths behind absurdity. When we first hear of a war fought over a pastry, we laugh. It seems childish, ridiculous, unworthy of serious thought. But as with many of history's farces, the laughter fades once we look closely. Beneath the frosting lies blood, beneath the comedy, tragedy. The Pastry War, in all its strangeness, reveals more about the nature of nations than many grander conflicts ever could. It tells us how pride can become a weapon sharper than steel, how humiliation can scar more deeply than wounds, and how the illusion of honor can blind entire governments to reason. It was, in its essence, a war between two insecurities, one imperial, one republican, both desperate to be seen, both terrified of being ignored. France, under Louis-Philippe, sought to reassert its relevance in a world that had begun to move on. The revolution was a fading memory, the Napoleonic glory long gone, and the monarchy needed victories to prove its legitimacy. Mexico, meanwhile, was struggling to define itself, trapped between the ghosts of its colonial past and the promise of a modern republic. When these insecurities collided, logic disappeared. What remained was theater, grand, tragic, and meaningless theater, staged upon the waters of Veracruz. The cannons fired not for justice, but for ego, and when the smoke cleared, nothing had changed, except for the number of graves. Yet, from the distance of nearly 2 centuries, the Pastry War becomes more than an episode of folly. It becomes a symbol of how fragile the idea of sovereignty can be. Independence is not merely declared, it must be defended, built, and believed in. The young Mexican Republic had inherited freedom, but not yet the strength to preserve it. It was a nation still learning how to stand. France, too, was haunted by its past. by the need to remind itself and others that it was still powerful, still relevant, still capable of commanding respect across the seas. In this sense, both countries were mirrors reflecting each other's fears. The war was absurd because it was unnecessary, but it was also inevitable because both sides were prisoners of pride. The lesson of the Pastry War lies not in its cannons, but in its consequences. Every nation faces moments when it must choose between pride and pragmatism, between appearance and survival. Mexico's tragedy, and perhaps its greatness, was that it so often chose pride. To fight, even when defeat was certain, became a kind of proof of existence. There is something noble in that defiance. And yet something tragic too, for pride can build nations as easily as it destroys them. France, on the other hand, won the war and lost the meaning of victory. It gained a few debts repaid, a few columns in the newspapers, and yet left behind only bitterness and a legacy of arrogance. Both nations emerged from the conflict diminished, though neither would admit it. History has a strange way of turning folly into lesson. What was once mocked as the war over a cake became a parable whispered through generations, a reminder that every empire, no matter how proud, is made of men just as fallible as those they claim to rule. In Mexico, the story of Monsieur Remontel's pastry became a kind of dark comedy. Repeated in schools, joked about in taverns, referenced in books, but underneath the laughter was a deeper sadness, the realization that for all their courage, for all their revolutions, Mexicans still lived in a world where their dignity could be negotiated by foreign guns. The war, then, was not merely absurd, it was prophetic. When we look back now, we can see the Pastry War as part of a continuum, a chapter in the larger story of Mexico's struggle for identity and self-respect. The same wounds opened in 1838 would resurface again and again, in the loss to the United States, in the French intervention of the 1860s, in the internal strife that tore through the century. Each conflict, in its own way, asked the same question: what does it mean to be free? Independence, they learned, was not a single act of rebellion, but a lifelong process of remembering who you are in the face of those who would define you. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Pastry War, that it forced a young nation to confront its reflection in the mirror of empire. There is also something deeply human in the story, something that transcends flags and treaties. How many of our greatest mistakes, both as nations and as individuals, are born from wounded pride? How often do we destroy what we love just to prove that we are not weak? The Pastry War may have been fought by generals and kings, but its essence is universal. It is the story of how easily honor turns to arrogance, and how quickly reason drowns in the noise of insult. A single pastry, a trivial demand, became the spark that ignited a nation's humiliation. It reminds us that in the theater of politics, small things often reveal the greatest truths. If we close our eyes and imagine the port of Veracruz today, we might still hear the sea whispering its old lament. The fortress of San Juan de Ulua still stands, scarred by cannon fire, its walls eroded by time and salt. Tourists walk where soldiers once fell. The wind carries the scent of the ocean, and with it, perhaps, the faint echo of distant drums. It is easy to forget that once, the fate of a nation turned on these shores, and that the smoke rising from the bombardment was not just the smoke of war, but of illusion, the illusion that power brings respect, that pride brings strength. In the end, both France and Mexico learned that smoke dissipates, and what remains is memory. And so the Pastry War endures, not as a tale of glory or defeat, but as a reminder, a quiet, ironic reminder, that history is written as much by our follies as by our triumphs. Every absurd war, every needless tragedy, every act of vanity carved into the annals of time speaks of the same fragile truth, that nations, like men, are ruled as much by their hearts as by their minds. Perhaps that is why this story still fascinates us. It is not the pastry that matters, nor the cannons, nor the treaties. It is the humanity behind them, proud, insecure, stubborn, magnificent humanity, forever learning, forever forgetting, forever repeating itself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed learning about this extraordinary event, please consider subscribing for more videos about forgotten moments in history. There are countless stories like this one, brief, fascinating, and full of lessons about power, ambition, and humanity. Until next time, I'm your narrator, and this was The Pastry War, when a cake started a war, France versus Mexico.